Namaskar. A warm welcome to World News and Indian Perspective on All India Radio. This is Saira Mujtaba, and with me is Nishit Kumar, bringing glimpses of the major developments of the day from across the globe. Over the next half an hour, we shall bring you the latest from the world of politics, economy, sports, entertainment, and more. The headlines. At least 16 people injured in a shootout at New York subway station in U.S. Police suspect lone wolf attack. India and U.S. reaffirmed their commitment to promote regional stability and rule of law at 4th 2+2 ministerial dialogue. Trade agreement signed with Australia and UAE will open infinite opportunities, says Indian Minister Piyush Goyal. India becomes first country in the world to administer first dose of COVID vaccine to 97% of 18+ population. 11,000 metric tons of rice from India reached Colombo ahead of New Year celebrations in Sri Lanka. And in IPL cricket, Chennai Super Kings set a victory target of 217 runs before Royal Challengers Bangalore in Mumbai. And now the news. In U.S., at least 16 people have been injured in a shootout at a subway station in Brooklyn, New York. Law enforcement officials said the injured have been admitted to various hospitals in the area after what the police think was a lone wolf attack. The police have described the suspected shooter as a man about 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing around 180 pounds. According to the police, the gunman acted alone, and investigation is now on to find the motive of the suspect. They said the all-out manhunt for the gunman is the investigators' top priority. As of now, no active bombs have been discovered in the area. New York Governor Casey Hochul said that her office will work with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and New York Police Department as the investigation continues. Consulate General of India in New York said that they are deeply disturbed by the horrific shooting in Brooklyn and are in touch with the local authorities. In a tweet, they said their prayers and thoughts are with those injured. India and the U.S. reaffirmed their commitment to promote regional stability and rule of law at the 4th 2+2 ministerial dialogue held in Washington on Monday night. We have a report.
Defence Minister Rajnath Singh and External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar led the Indian delegation. The U.S. delegation was led by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin. The dialogue enabled both sides to undertake a comprehensive review of cross-cutting issues in the India-U.S. bilateral agenda related to foreign policy, defence and security. Addressing media after the talks, Defence Minister Rajnath Singh said they had a meaningful discussion which will help in maintaining and expanding India-U.S. momentum. He said both nations have shared goals to achieve, and it is great that the world's two biggest democracies share same views on almost all world issues. During the meeting, they also discussed assessments of Indian Ocean region and its neighbors. The defense minister said they also discussed about terrorism being used as an instrument of statecraft against India. He said India's Department of Space and the U.S. Department of Defense have concluded a space situational awareness agreement. An agreement on defense space and defense artificial intelligence dialogues has also been reached. He added that many other initiatives and agreements which are in the discussion phase have been agreed to be expanded for progress in the scope and depth of India-US military engagements. Mr. Singh said both nations also talked about further cooperation in the defense, cyber and special forces field, including LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement. He urged American companies to come and invest in India and support the Make in India program.
भारत और अमेरिका के बीच एक स्ट्रेटेजिक रिलेशनशिप है, क्योंकि दोनों एक दूसरे के स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनर हैं। और मैंने यह आग्रह किया है अमेरिका से कि अमेरिका आकर भारत में यहाँ पर फोकस करे विशेष रूप से को डेवलपमेंट और को प्रोडक्शन पर। यहाँ की जो OEMs हैं वो भारत में आए, उनका स्वागत है, क्योंकि भारत में एक निर्णय है मेक इन इंडिया और मेक फॉर द वर्ल्ड। भारत को यदि हम सेल्फ रिलायंस बनाना चाहते हैं तो।
In his address to the media, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar said the meeting took place at a time when the global audience is facing multiple challenges and stresses. The External Affairs Minister stated that India buys some energy from Russia necessary for its energy security. He however added that India's purchases for the month would be less than what Europe makes in an afternoon.
If you are looking at energy purchases from Russia, I would suggest that your attention should be focused on Europe. We do buy some energy which is necessary for our energy security, but I suspect, looking at the figures, probably our total purchases for the month would be less than what Europe does in an afternoon. So you might want to think about it.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said India has to make its own decisions about how it approaches the Ukraine challenge.
India is providing significant humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. India has to make its own decisions about how it approaches this challenge. In our judgment, it is important that all countries, especially those with leverage, press Putin to end the war. And it's also important that democracies stand together and speak with one voice to defend the values that we share. India's relationship with Russia has developed over decades. Today, we are able and willing to be a partner of choice with India.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said President Joe Biden truly values strong alliances and partnerships like the one with India.
Regarding missed opportunities, of course, I can't say much about policy decisions that were made before my time. But what I can tell you is that President Biden truly values strong alliances and partnerships like the one that we have with India. And that's really what today is all about. It's about taking a strong relationship and making it even stronger.
Abhishek Mukhopadhyay for World News.
In today's Hotspot section, we bring you a discussion on India-US Virtual Summit and 2+2 Dialogue for Robust Ties. In conversation are Sushant Sareen, Strategic Analyst, and Simran Sodhi, Journalist.
Today we are discussing the India-US relationship, and this comes in the wake of the two leaders holding a virtual meeting which comes ahead of the India-US 2+2 dialogue. We will have Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting US President Joe Biden in a virtual summit, and we will also have the India-US dialogue which is taking place in Washington DC this year. Mr. Sareen, when you see this activity which is happening on the India-US front, how much weightage does this lend to a relationship which we have seen of late getting really strong?
I think this is quite important what is happening. Also a little unusual because normally the 2+2 meeting in a sense prepares for a meeting between the two principals. But this time the meeting of the two principals, that is the Prime Minister of India and the President of the US, is happening just on the eve of the 2+2 meeting. Now, it is possible that it could set the tone for the 2+2 meeting, which could then take things forward and further ease the path for the two principals, or it could be that there are other issues beyond the 2+2 which are likely to be discussed. I think a bit of both is likely to happen. Also, the growing, in a manner of speaking, the areas of divergence which both sides are working to reduce. We are not exactly seeing eye to eye on the Ukraine conflict. While India would agree that what has happened in Ukraine, India has not endorsed the Russian invasion, but India has not taken the same stand which the United States has taken, and that is where the divergence is coming. India's option is that let's talk about diplomacy, let's talk about keep lines of communication open. So we are taking that line, while the American line is diametrically opposite to the line we are taking. So that is a issue of some divergence between the two sides. But rather than recriminations, I think what both sides are trying to do is narrow down the differences, try and coordinate better. And in a manner of speaking, that shows you the strength of the relationship. At the same time, I think it also should inform everybody in the world that whatever noise is being made in the American media, that noise is not really being reflected by the US administration, which is trying to work its way with India.
Mr. Sareen, we also see that the statement which has been issued by the White House has said that President Biden will continue our close consultations on the consequences of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine and mitigating its destabilizing impact on global food supply and commodity markets. We've also seen the Ministry of External Affairs here issuing a statement where they have said that the two leaders will review ongoing bilateral cooperation and exchange views on recent developments in South Asia, the Indo-Pacific region, and global issues of mutual interest. Do you feel, when we look at both the statements, that both countries are trying to find convergence? And as you explained, the issue of Ukraine sees both India and the US taking different views, but despite that, would you say that there is an attempt for convergence rather than divergence?
Ukraine is not the first time that there is a certain divergence in our views. Let me try and explain this. See, even on Afghanistan, both India and the United States wanted the same thing in Afghanistan. There was no divergence between what India wanted and what the US wanted in Afghanistan. The only divergence was on how to get what we wanted out there. In Ukraine, for example, India has already said it in public forums, in international forums, at the United Nations, that we stand for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. So exactly what the Americans stand. We have said that we do not endorse the violence in Ukraine and violence must immediately stop. Exactly what the Americans want to happen. So what we want is the same thing as the Americans want. The only difference is in the kind of tools and instruments which are to be used and the means which are to be used to reach that point. And that is where the divergence is coming. Now, the end objective is clear and there is a divergence on the means to be used. I'm sure that that divergence can be narrowed down. There might not be complete congruity between what our position is and what the American position is. But I don't think that there will be a complete dichotomy between what we want and between what the Americans are wanting. I would suspect that we can move forward on issues like Ukraine simply because the objective is the same. And I think the effort from both sides is to be able to work together, even though we might not entirely agree on the measures which the other side might be adopting or might be advocating.
Mr. Sarin, we also see that India and the United States will hold their 4th annual +2 dialogue in DC. We have External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar and the Defense Minister both in the US at currently. And a number of issues will be high on agenda like climate, public health, building supply chains. How important do you think is this regular 2+2 defense and the foreign ministry dialogue which is taking place between the two countries? How important is this in not just sustaining this relationship, but also, as we have discussed, when we have differences in the relationship, it also sustains it and taking it forward?
I think it's extremely important. I think this is just a one step lower than a summit level meeting. And what we are having now is both a summit level meeting, albeit virtual, and the 2+2. So it shows you the level of engagement between the two sides. So I think it's extremely crucial, number one. Number two, the breadth of agenda which is there. You name the issue, that issue is being discussed. From defense, security, climate, international politics, you name it, it's all on the table. And that tells you the sheer stance of both the countries engaging each other. And that's important because India does not want and India cannot be typecast in only a particular region. While our own immediate region is of course critical, but to say that, okay, we will only engage with India insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned or South Asia is concerned, that's not acceptable to India. And I think the Americans have understood it, and that is why on global issues, there is this level of engagement which is taking place. And as far as the future of the relationship between India and the United States is concerned, what I mean to say is that there was a time when many of the countries in the world would look at India only from the prism of South Asia. For a certain amount of time, the Americans looked at India only from the prism of China or of Pakistan or of some other place. Now that prism has changed. Now it's a global prism from which they look at India and the role that India can play in what are called the global issues. So I think that's a huge change which has come about between India and the US and how the two sides engage with each other. And meetings like the 2+2, in fact, the entire format of 2+2 has been devised as just one step lower than the summit, but with both the defense and the foreign ministers as part of it to discuss all the critical issues going forward.
Mr. Sarin, we've also seen India abstaining at almost a dozen United Nations resolutions on the Ukraine invasion, and India has had to diplomatically walk this tightrope between its relations with Russia and its relations with the US. Do you feel that this is something India has been able to explain or put out successfully to the global community, that while it understands the global implications of the Ukraine war, among other things that are happening, India is also taking steps and positions which are in its own interest? Has the outreach or the message gone out successfully?
I think it's a mixed bag, and we should admit that it's a mixed bag. In the sense that we have tried to explain our position, there are the more sober and sensible elements in the Western world have understood where we are coming from, what we are trying to say, what we are trying to do. I think there is a level of understanding for our compulsions, for our interests, and how we are trying to defend ourselves from some of the trends which are emerging. So there is that. But there is also the noise which is coming. For example, in the American media, much of it is politically driven rather than based on any level of sense or any real analysis. So one is that factor. The other thing is that every country in the world, look, if India and the Americans are getting together and working closely together, it's not because there's suddenly a love fest between the two sides. All countries get together, work together because they see a convergence of interests. And between the Indians and the Americans, or the Indian and the Western world, there is convergence of interests, not only on global issues, but on political issues, on ideological issues, on a range of issues. There are differences as well. But despite that, I think the convergences are more important. And because our interests are converging, we are engaging with each other at levels which we have not done in the past, when our interests did not entirely converge. So for anyone to expect that India will overnight simply turn around from its own interests and work in the interests of somebody else, I think that's quite mindless. That's not going to happen. Now, what are India's interests? I think we need to be clear on that. We have very close political and diplomatic relations with the Russians. We might not have endorsed their actions, but that does not mean that we are ready to say goodbye to the Russians. We have certain amount of dependence on the Russians. Insofar as the defense sector is concerned, a lot of our defense equipment and supplies come from Russia. So that is something which we cannot ignore. There is this whole issue of India buying oil from Russia, but then it's an open offer. Anybody can beat the price at which Russians are giving oil to us. We're more than happy to not buy Russian oil and buy oil from elsewhere. But nobody is willing to give us that deal. And we have very serious issues of poverty, which we are trying to address, of cost of living of our people, of the welfare of Indians. And if we can get oil cheaper, and that's not going to last permanently, maybe for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and it's not as though we are buying the bulk of Russian oil. The oil which we are buying from Russia is a minuscule amount compared to what some of the Western countries are buying. So for anyone to say that India is fueling the Russian war machinery, it's utter nonsense. We are doing no such thing. In fact, the Europeans and the other countries aligned to the West are buying much more oil and gas from Russia than we are. And just as they cannot turn the tap on the Russian oil and gas supplies, even we can't turn off the tap on Russian defense supplies. It cannot happen overnight. And yet, if you look at the long-term trend, India has been diversifying even its defense purchases. So I think there is that understanding in the West, and this is exactly what we are trying to explain to our interlocutors in the Western world. Some of them are understanding it and appreciating our problems. Others are being a little bloody-minded about it, but I suppose that's just the way it is. They will, of course, try and wean us to their side, which is, again, nothing extraordinary or unusual about it. Every side tries to do that, just as we will try to do it. So I don't take anything amiss in that. But ultimately, it will be a function of diplomacy on where we reach an equilibrium in our relationship on this particular issue. And I'm sure we have very experienced diplomats handling these negotiations. And we have a certain amount of wisdom with which we will approach these matters. I don't think there will be any knee-jerk reaction or response from the Indian side or from the other side. So I expect to work out eventually. I don't foresee much of a problem.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on the India-US relationship, and we will follow Prime Minister Modi's virtual summit with the US President and the US-India 2+2 dialogue. With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
India's Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal has said that the new economic cooperation and trade agreements with Australia and UAE will open infinite opportunities for textiles, handloom and footwear. Addressing a function in New Delhi on Tuesday, he said that the Indian textile exports to Australia and UAE would now face zero duty and expressed confidence that soon Europe, Canada and UK would also welcome Indian textile exports at zero duty. Mr. Goyal said that the trade agreements will help in increasing exports from labor-intensive industries. He also said that the Indian textile industry has the potential to achieve $100 billion in exports by 2030. This is All India Radio giving you the news. For quick news updates around the clock, follow us on Twitter at AIR News Alerts.
Health and Family Welfare Minister Dr. Mansukh Mandavia said India is the first country in the world to administer the first dose of COVID vaccine to 97% of the people above the age of 18 years. He said 85% of the people have already taken the second dose. While briefing the media on Tuesday, Dr. Mandavia said over 5.77 lakh people in the age group of 15 to 18 years have been given the first dose and 3.98 lakh people have been administered the second dose. Appreciating the country's COVID management and vaccination drive, he said the world witnessed the mention of India's COVID management and vaccination drive in the Vaccine Global Alliance meeting in Geneva. He said the world was amazed to see that 2.5 crore vaccine doses were administered in a day in the country, which is not a small deal. The inaugural delivery of COVID vaccines under the Quad's flagship vaccine partnership was made in Cambodia today. Ambassador of India to Cambodia, Devyani Khobragade, along with representatives from the embassies of Australia, Japan and US to Cambodia, jointly handed over a consignment of 3,25,000 doses of Made in India Covishield vaccine to Prime Minister of Cambodia, Hun Sen, at the Peace Palace in Phnom Penh. The vaccines have been gifted by India as part of Prime Minister Modi's commitment to donate 500,000 doses of COVID vaccine to the Indo-Pacific under the Quad Vaccine Initiative.
WHO says it is tracking a few dozen cases of two new subvariants of the highly transmissible Omicron strain of coronavirus to assess whether they are more infectious or dangerous. It has added BA.4 and BA.5 sister variants of the original BA.1 Omicron variant to its list for monitoring. It is already tracking BA.1 and BA.2, now globally dominant, as well as BA.1.1 and BA.3. The World Health Organization said it has begun tracking them because of their additional mutations that need to be further studied to understand their impact on immune escape potential. Sri Lanka's central bank has said it had become challenging and impossible to repay external debt as it tries to use its dwindling foreign exchange reserves to import essentials like fuel. Central Bank of Sri Lanka's Governor P. Nandalal Veerasinghe told reporters that they need to focus on essential imports and not to have to worry about servicing external debt. Veerasinghe said the suspension of payment would be until the country came to an agreement with creditors and with the support of a loan program with the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Street protests against shortages of fuel, power, food and medicine have gone on for more than a month in the country. In Sri Lanka, the doctors have warned they are almost out of life-saving medicines as the country's economic crisis threatens a worse death toll than the coronavirus pandemic.
11,000 metric tons of rice from India reached Colombo on Tuesday ahead of the New Year celebrations in Sri Lanka. Last week, India had supplied 16,000 metric tons rice to Sri Lanka under the multi-pronged support. In a tweet, the Indian Embassy in Sri Lanka said these supplies, which mark a special bond between the two nations, will continue. India's Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla on Tuesday convened the first meeting of Inter-Ministerial Coordination Group for Comprehensive Management of Relations with the neighbouring countries. The External Affairs Ministry spokesperson Arindam Bagchi said in a tweet that the IMCG provided a comprehensive direction with a whole-of-government approach to promote better connectivity, stronger interlinkages and greater people-to-people connect with India's neighbours. Sources said issues considered by the Inter-Ministerial Coordination Group include construction of border infrastructure that would facilitate greater trade with neighbours like Nepal, special needs of countries such as Bhutan and the Maldives in terms of supply of essential commodities, opening rail connectivity with Bangladesh, humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan and Myanmar, and fisheries issue with Sri Lanka were among the other issues considered.
The fifth Foreign Office consultations between India and Malaysia were held on Tuesday at Putrajaya in Malaysia. Saurabh Kumar, Secretary East in the Ministry of External Affairs, co-chaired the consultations together with Amran bin Mohammed Zin, Deputy Secretary General for Bilateral Affairs in the Malaysian Foreign Affairs Ministry. Both sides reviewed the multifaceted relations between India and Malaysia during the Foreign Office consultations. They expressed their desire to advance the overall bilateral relations within the framework of the Enhanced Strategic Partnership of 2015. The first ever consultations between India and France and West Asia and North Africa region were held in virtual mode on Tuesday. They were co-chaired by the Ambassador Anne Guegan, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Directorate, Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, France, and Dr. Pradeep Singh Rajpurohit, Joint Secretary, External Affairs Ministry. The two sides had wide-ranging discussions on respective priorities, areas of mutual interest, and exchanged views on major issues including the political, security, economic and trade dimensions of the West Asia and North Africa region.
The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has warned that sharply higher global food and energy prices due to Ukraine war are hitting developing countries hard. It also said that better mechanisms for dealing with sovereign debt stress will be needed to stave off defaults. Director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, Vitor Gaspar, said spikes in food and energy prices were hitting low-income countries particularly hard, and they may need more grants and highly concessional financing. He also said countries should undertake reforms to improve debt transparency and strengthen debt management policies to reduce risks. On to sports. In IPL cricket, Chennai Super Kings have set a victory target of 217 runs before Royal Challengers Bangalore at D.Y. Patil Sports Academy in Navi Mumbai. Chennai scored 216 for 4 in 20 overs. In reply, Royal Challengers Bangalore were 146 for 7 in 15.2 overs when reports last came in. Earlier, Royal Challengers Bangalore won the toss and opted to field first.
And now let us take a look at the major developments around the world as reported in the foreign press. Let us take a look at the press reports on China. CNN reports as strict COVID-19 lockdowns have left Shanghai residents struggling to access food or medical care. Citizens elsewhere in China fear similar stringent measures are heading their way, even as officials seek to assure the public they are well prepared. TOI reports US will stand by India against China's belligerence on border. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told his Indian counterpart Rajnath Singh. The statesman writes human rights violation continues to take place in Tibet despite the Chinese Communist Party's promise to improve it on many occasions, according to a Canada-based think tank, International Forum for Rights and Security.
Now let's take a look at the press reports on Pakistan. The Express Tribune reports that Islamabad High Court on Monday dismissed a petition praying the court to register a treason case against former Prime Minister Imran Khan and various ministers as inadmissible. Pakistan Observer reports that the Lahore court has expressed annoyance at the delays in Punjab's CM election case.
Now, let's have a look at the press reports on Balochistan. The Balochistan Post writes 20 people from different parts of Balochistan have gone missing after being abducted allegedly by Pakistani military forces. And now let's have a look at what is making headlines in Afghanistan. Al Jazeera reports how a small group of Afghan refugees say they are trapped on African island nation of Madagascar without healthcare, education or work.
And now, before we wrap up, a quick look at the headlines once again. At least 16 people injured in a shootout at New York subway station in U.S. Police suspect lone wolf attack. India and U.S. reaffirmed their commitment to promote regional stability and rule of law at 4th 2+2 ministerial dialogue. Trade agreement signed with Australia and UAE will open infinite opportunities, says Indian Minister Piyush Goyal. India becomes the first country in the world to administer first dose of COVID vaccine to 97% of 18-plus population. 11,000 metric tons of rice from India reach Colombo ahead of New Year celebrations in Sri Lanka. And in IPL cricket, Chennai Super Kings set a victory target of 217 runs before Royal Challengers Bangalore in Mumbai. And now, before we end, let us listen to Mahatma Gandhi's favorite bhajan, Vaishnav Jan, by artists from Zimbabwe. And with that, we end this bulletin. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the next edition of World News.